Really very pleased to have Thomas Ray here in Ashland at Exploring Psychedelics speaking with us. Thomas is someone who's been on my podcast a couple different times, and probably, well, I wouldn't say probably, that I've received more comments from listeners to my podcast about the interviews that I've done with Tom than anybody else, because he has a very interesting research project that he's been working on, and the way that he's addressing the neurological functions of different psychedelics and how they're related to what he likes to call organs of the mind is a presentation that really nobody else has been working on. And he's got some very unique perspectives and insights on this, and we both agree that there's really some paradigm shifting stuff that he is doing in his work. So it's going to be very scientific. You're going to want to pay attention to the slides because there'll be lots of amazing information in there. Let's go ahead and welcome Thomas Ray, all the way from the University of Oklahoma, right? Yeah.
Transform Press is planning to release a few hundred pages of this work next month as an open access publication to be followed later by a book. The topic is the human mind, which is the most complex known entity. It's also one of the great frontiers of science. But science is kind of hesitated as it approaches the mind. I think there's a bit of a cultural problem in that the way scientists are trained doesn't prepare them to confront the subjective experience. They feel disarmed, they're not sure how to use their toolkit to move forward. I was trained conceptually as an evolutionary biologist and practically as a naturalist, working in tropical rainforests in Costa Rica since 1974. And I believe that natural history is really the most appropriate scientific method to use in approaching the mind at this stage of our understanding, or better said, lack of understanding. The great thing about natural history is that you go out into complex nature like the tropical rainforest or the human mind. You go out with open eyes and you're looking for patterns. You don't even have to go out with a hypothesis or even a question, because if it's an unknown territory, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, and you're going to see amazing things, and these patterns that you see come as insights, which can then be reframed as hypotheses to bring the experimental method in. But until we do the natural history, we don't even know what questions to ask. This is how I propose to begin. Shogun pioneered the method. His first psychedelic experience was mescaline. In that experience, his most compelling insight was everything I recognized came from the depths of my memory and psyche. There are chemicals that can catalyze its availability. This has been said over and over again by the speakers at this meeting. Then he began his chemical journey. He started with the mescaline molecule. He made a little tweak. He added a carbon and two hydrogens. He got TMA. And where there had been beauty, there came anger. And he says, different drugs may open different doors in a person, but all those doors lead out of the same unconscious. And said, the doors opened by DMT tend to be quite different than those opened by mescaline. What you encounter is part of yourself. This is a key insight. What these drugs are doing is bringing into consciousness aspects of the psyche that are normally not in consciousness. It's a method for exploring the mind. The title is The Breadth and Depth of Consciousness, Mental Organs and the Breadth and Depth of Consciousness. And I credit Shulgin with creating the study of breadth. His toolkit, the hundreds of chemicals that he developed and tested in humans, exposed the breadth of consciousness, that is, the diversity of mental effects and mental organs. In an interview, Sasha said, I'm looking for tools that can be used for studying the mind. He created hundreds of drugs, and he mapped the relationship between the drug and the mind. Then he goes on to say, and other people will then use the tools in finding out the aspects of the mental process and how it ties to the brain. So other people will put the brain between his drug and the mind. That's where I come in, putting the brain in there. The way I do that, I've done that, is to go to the Psychoactive Drug Screening Program, which is a service provided by the National Institute of Mental Health, and they approved my request to assay these 25 drugs against the human receptorome. This set of drugs was selected in collaboration with Sasha and Dave Nichols. Sasha kind of drew up the first list based on qualitative diversity, and then we added some structural diversity. I also found 10 more drugs from the literature that had also been assayed by the PDSP, 35 drugs. During the course of this lecture, I'll make some generalizations. I'll say this drug is the most whatever of all psychedelic drugs. I'm only referring to the 35 psychedelic drugs here. And sometimes I'm only going to be referring to the 22 drugs. So when I make generalizations, it's not about all drugs, it's just about the drugs of my study. The method is the synthesis of the molecular data with the human natural history, which is the trip reports. The molecular data that comes to be sort of in this form where each column is a drug and each row is a receptor. And then we have the trip reports. This is one of my favorites. It's 2CT7. It's not a drug of the study, but it's a great report. And I just want you to know that no prior knowledge of receptors is needed. If you don't know anything about receptors, don't be intimidated when I'm rattling off the names of receptors you've never heard. I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about the receptors I'm going to talk about today. Now, if you happen to have some knowledge of receptors, just set that aside today, because I'm going to give a new view on those receptors, and it's not always going to be consistent with what you've learned about those receptors. So those of you who don't know anything about receptors are going to be better off than those of you who do know things about receptors. And I'm going to use the language of mental organs to tell this story. It's not a new idea. This is an old drawing. The idea is that there are different sort of physical parts of the brain that produce different specific mental properties. But I've reified this by connecting it to the receptors, and I define mental organ as a population of neurons that express a specific receptor. So it could be serotonin 2A, and by the way, 5-HT is an abbreviation for serotonin. So serotonin 2A or dopamine 2 or sigma-1. These receptors, specific receptor, creates a population of neurons tuned to a specific mental function. They can perform a specific function in the mind. Potentially, there's one for each of more than 300 different modulatory receptor types expressed in the brain, but we don't know if every modulatory receptor defines a mental organ. So we don't actually know how many there are. I've characterized 13. We don't know anything about the topology of these. They haven't been mapped, but I can be pretty sure that they're not contiguous three-dimensional volumes as drawn in this figure. They're populations of neurons, they're networks, they're woven together. Remains to be seen what the topology is. The topic is depth and breadth. So let me just throw depth and breadth out here to begin with. Breadth is how many mental organs are in consciousness. The breadth of each drug can be characterized by how many mental organs it interacts with and how strongly it interacts with each of those. So it's the sum of the strength of the interaction across mental organs. Depth turns out to be just serotonin 7, which probably you've never heard of. I'm going to tell you all about it today. It's the most psychedelic receptor. Serotonin 7 is consciousness itself. I'm going to use this brain icon without the serotonin 7. The brain icon doesn't represent the brain. It represents consciousness. Consciousness as mediated by this specific mental organ, serotonin 7. When you see that brain, don't think brain, think mind. That's the depth of consciousness. The hands of the mind are serotonin 2. It seems that serotonin 2 can do a lot of different things in the mind, and it can do them simultaneously. It brings to mind the Hindu goddess Durga that has many hands, each doing a different thing at the same time. That would be serotonin 2. Breadth is all of these other mental organs. The hands that you see, these are the serotonin 2 hands. These are the hands of the goddess Durga, doing one of the things they can do, which is to hold a mental organ in consciousness. We see 5 hands of the mind holding 5 different mental organs. That's dopamine, sigma, alpha, could be alpha 1 or alpha 2 or both, imidazoline, histamine. Those are all being held in consciousness by the hands of the mind, serotonin 2. Now, I've been told that this work is too technical for some people, and I don't believe it. I'm going to bring you along. I'm going to make you comfortable with these figures because this is how I illustrate the drugs in a way that we can understand why they do the things that they do. How can we understand the qualitative diversity between these drugs? These are the figures that make this clear. It's a rare drug that only interacts with a single receptor. But salvinorin A, the active ingredient of salvia, is one of those drugs, apparently. It only acts with the kappa opioid receptor. So we see a single bar for salvinorin A. What's more typical is to interact with several bars, as we see for TMA2 and MEM, but there are some drugs that are, the word promiscuous has been used, so I'll use it too. There are some drugs that interact with lots of receptors, so I've drawn some of those in there too. This is about breadth. Breadth is how many mental organs the drug is interacting with, but just because the sensitive instrument of the psychoactive drug screening program can measure a lot of receptor interactions doesn't mean that those are perceptible. So I've drawn these black vertical bars representing the limit of perceptibility. DOB is a good illustration of that. As a rule of thumb in psychopharmacology, 100-fold selectivity means absolute selectivity. So basically, we can only perceive receptor affinities within the first 2 orders of magnitude. And this probably only applies to drugs that activate receptors, not drugs that inhibit receptors. The vertical axis here is orders of magnitude of infinity from 0 to 4, because none of the drugs exceed 4 orders of magnitude, so I'm using a 4-point scale. We're only able to perceive the top 2 orders of magnitude. So I've always drawn this black vertical bar between the 2 bars that represent above 2 and below 2. So we're just looking at everything within the first 2 orders of magnitude. Look at DOB and DOI. They both were measured at about the same number of receptors, but for DOB, the affinity drops off steeply in the first few receptors until most of the ones that were measured are actually imperceptible, whereas for DOI, the affinity drops off gradually such that by the time we reach the limit of infinity, 19 receptors are perceptible. DOI is much broader, has much greater breadth than DOB, even though, at first glance they look the same. They're not. Another thing is that the black vertical bar is drawn at an arbitrary round number of 2 orders of magnitude. Lots of observations suggest that that's a conservative measure and that the limit of perceptibility is reached a little bit before we get there. In other words, in MEM, the sigma is not perceptible. In DOB, the beta is not perceptible. I want to talk about the flavor of a drug. It's dominated by the best hit. So whatever receptor has the highest affinity will dominate the flavor. But it blends together with the flavor of all the other receptors that we interact with, just like food, just like a stew. So if I was going to make a stew with paprika, oregano, and basil, and if I put lots of paprika and just a little basil, that would be different than the same 3 spices where it was lots of basil and just a little paprika, even though it's the same 3 spices. The proportions matter, and the proportions matter for these receptors that we're interacting with too. Serotonin is not a flavor. Serotonin receptors provide the mechanisms of consciousness, not the contents of consciousness. So serotonin 1 and serotonin 2 don't produce obvious flavors. Serotonin 7, on the other hand, is the most psychedelic receptor, but it's not really the same thing as flavor. It's more of a flavor enhancer than a flavor in itself. All of these bars that are appearing just gray, those are serotonin, and you can ignore them when you're trying to understand the flavor. You just want to look at the colored bars. For TMA, there's only one colored bar. It's histamine. The flavor of TMA2 is dominated by histamine. For DOM, we've got a tablespoon of beta and a dash of alpha 2. Its flavor is going to be dominated by beta, but if you're a sensitive gourmet, you may be able to detect the alpha 2 in DOM. For psilocin, there's only one flavor. It's dopamine 1 and dopamine 2. That's the dominant flavor of psilocin and really the only flavor, but it's got the flavor enhancer in there. The serotonin 7 is important, but it's not determining the flavor. It's only enhancing the flavor. You got it with the bars? Are there any questions about the bars? This is the technical part. Are you with me?
Yes.
Okay. Breadth. Breadth is how many receptors a drug interacts with. So I just quantified that and I ranked them from the highest breadth down to the lowest breadth. So the top 3, the broadest are DMT, DPT, and DOI. The lowest are TMA2 and MEM. So let's look at those 5. The top 3 and the bottom 2. The limit of perceptibility counts 17 bars for DMT and 21 bars for DPT, but I'm telling you that DMT has greater breadth. Why? Because the bars on DMT are taller. And what we really want is the area under those bars. And because the bars on DPT are lower, doesn't matter that there's more of them, they don't add up to as much as DMT. So DMT has the greatest breadth of all the drugs in the study. TMA2, on the other hand, only has these 4. MEM, I'm only counting 2 because this last one is actually beyond the limit of perceptibility. Breadth. You understand breadth? Breadth is how many receptors are brought into the mix. How many spices do we put into the stew? Yes?
So you're basically saying it's the area under the bars
Yes.
Before the end of perceptibility.
That's exactly right, with the caveat that it's actually the square root of the sum of the square of the height of the bars, but let's not get into those. That's why you were asking that question, right? Okay. Serotonin 2 became the paradigmatic psychedelic receptor 30 years ago, during a period in which prohibition led to the study of psychedelic drugs in rodents, when most of the drugs of this study had not been invented. when an adequate body of subjective human data on diverse psychedelics could not be assembled, when our knowledge of neurotransmitter diversity was dramatically incomplete, we only knew of 2 of the 14 serotonin receptors, when reliable affinity screening at broad panel of receptors was not possible, and a decade before serotonin 7, the most psychedelic receptor, was even discovered. We had a premature convergence on serotonin 2. We need to take a fresh look. I'm listing the receptors, and the breadth that we're looking at is their breadth of interaction with the psychedelic drugs. What rises to the top is serotonin 2, serotonin 1. Serotonin 7 is third in the list. Down at the bottom, we've got NET, the norepinephrine transporter, and the delta opioid receptor. Let's look at those 5. You can see these ones at the top are interacting with most of the psychedelic drugs. These ones at the bottom have no perceptible interaction with any of the psychedelic drugs. Serotonin 7 is an overlooked one. It's numbered 7 because it's the 7th major class of serotonin receptors to be discovered, so it's the one that we've known for the shortest amount of time, and not much is known about it, but turns out to be the most psychedelic receptor. So I've characterized 13 mental organs. I'm going to rattle through those names, but before I do, I want to remind you that no prior knowledge of receptors is needed. I'll tell you everything you need to know about these receptors as we get to them. Serotonin 7, kappa, serotonin 2, cannabinoid 1, serotonin 1, beta, histamine 1, alpha 2, alpha 1, dopamine, imidazoline, mu, and sigma. Okay, we've got 13 mental organs. Let's categorize them. The cognitive mind is only fully developed in modern adult humans. Children that we develop from and the animals that we evolved from lack this cognitive mind. Only modern adult humans have it. When I talk about the division between cognitive and affective, it's also division between reason and feeling, head and heart, modern and archaic, adult and child, human and animal. Our minds shift from affective to cognitive as we evolve into modern humans and as we grow from an infant to an adult. Rodin captured this distinction in these statues. The thinker is lost in thought. The couple in the kiss are lost in feeling. Here's a left brain, right brain diagram that also captures the difference. And I have no idea if the cognitive and affective mental organs are lateralized, don't know. But it's a nice illustration of the distinction between the two. One of the most stunning things to come out of this is that there are 2 mental organs of consciousness, one modern and one archaic. Kappa provides the consciousness of the archaic mind and the modern human childhood mind. It's affective only. It's all heart and no head. The archetypical kappa drug is salvia, salvinorin A. The other mental organ of consciousness is serotonin 7. It's modern adult human consciousness. It's backward compatible. So it holds both cognitive and affective content, whereas the old one held affective only. So it's head and heart. And the archetypical serotonin 7 drug is 5-methoxy-DMT, which is the drug that most cleanly presents the serotonin 7 mental organ. As adult humans, we live in the cognitive mind, and we know it. We live it. It's harder for some of us to get the affective mind. So I'm going to spend a fair bit of time talking about affect just to kind of get the idea across. I shouldn't put it that way. Get the feeling across. So here's a salvia trip report. I felt like I was 8 years old in a park around my house in a swing during the middle of a summer day. Note, I didn't see any of this. It was purely a feeling. Now this is a stunning report. If you think about the implications of this, they're describing a scene that they experienced. They've laid out a few words for us, but they're probably experiencing in much richer detail, subtle, and nuance than what's written on the page. And yet, they didn't see it, they didn't think about it, they felt it. What this is telling us is that feeling is a language of description for representing the world in the mind. And this is something that we tend to forget. It's a rich language of description. It produces thought-free awareness. It's been called thought-free awareness. I want to illustrate this with a story and a parable. We live in Oklahoma, and one day a tornado was passing through our neighborhood, and we were getting ready to go down into the shelter when our ducks, who were in the pond on the other side of the house, came running around the house in a panic and running and flying at the same time, and they came to the back door. So I went and I got their cage, which they had long ago outgrown. I brought it out, I opened the door, and one by one they squeezed themselves into this cage, and then the 5 of us, the 3 ducks, my wife and I, we went down into the shelter, and the ducks were completely at peace. This illustrates thought-free awareness. They felt the menace of the storm, they felt the need to come to me, and they felt the security of the shelter. Thought-free awareness. The parable is, imagine an infant who's just learned to crawl. Wow, they're exploring the world, they're crawling around, they're putting things things in their mouth, they're touching things, and they head for the electrical outlet on the wall, and the parent totally freaks, and the parent runs over, no, don't do that. Now, this is maybe a 3-month-old infant. They don't understand a word their parents are saying, but they get the body language, they get the facial expression, they get the tone of voice, and what's more, when they grow up, even if they don't remember the incident, even if they never learn anything about electricity, for the rest of their life they're going to be standoffish about electrical outlets. They just know it in a very deep sense that that's bad stuff right there. That's dangerous. Thought-free awareness. Charles Tart described in his first mescaline experience, he described for the first time in his life really knowing what beauty is. He had referred to it hundreds of times before. He was essentially running an emulation of beauty, but he says, now I understand that I had never even begun to penetrate what beauty was all about. The incredible and intense immediate experience of beauty. To the modern mind, beauty is a noun. To the archaic mind, beauty is a feeling. And lots of things are like that. So beauty, home is a feeling. Elegance, majesty, adventure, all of those are feelings in the archaic mind or the psychedelic mind. Feelings are a language older than words. Before spoken language emerged, feelings had evolved into a very rich language of expression for representing the world around us, or the internal world, in consciousness, but it had the problem of being ineffable, and in a highly social species there is a powerful need to be able to communicate what we're holding in consciousness. So words evolved, they crystallized around this pre-existing language of feeling, and now we had words that would allow us to communicate the feelings that we were having, like beauty, majesty, home. We can now put that into wording and communicate it. But feelings were rich, and still are, a rich language of description for the world, representing the world in consciousness. It's a lot like flavor. If you taste a fine curry or smell a rose, it produces a feeling, a sensation, and you know what it tastes like, you know what it smells like, and we don't question that, we just take it as a given. The feelings that I'm talking about are a lot like flavor in that sense. That's one way of dividing the mental organs between cognitive and affective. Check. There's another way I want to go through. There are many content mental organs which collectively provide the breadth of consciousness, and then there are the mechanisms of consciousness. The hands of the mind shape the breadth, in fact they shape all of consciousness, and then the mental space is the depth. Let's go through the mental organs again with these categories. Let's look at breadth first. Each content mental organ paints a different facet of reality in consciousness, and each one of these content mental organs can be in consciousness or not. The more content mental organs there are in consciousness, the greater breadth, means a representation of reality that is more multifaceted and more complete. Now I'm going to go through a bunch of them, and I want to weave in a story as I go through this. The idea is that some of the major philosophical, religious, or secular traditions may have been founded on an exceptionally rich bloom of a mental organ or so. I'm going to represent that narrative with the lotus blossom. When you see that, you'll know I'm telling this story. One of the ways of knowing is language, logic, and reason. Lotus blossom. I posit that Socrates had an exceptionally rich bloom of the serotonin 1 mental organ, which provides language, logic, and reason. He taught people to think rationally at a time when it wasn't done. He's credited with the origin of the concept. From Socrates and others ultimately flowed the age of reason and the age of enlightenment. Serotonin 1 is the basis of LSD microdose, the primary basis. If you microdose, you're not going to perceive the receptors or mental organs down on the list. You're only going to perceive the tallest bars. Here's 4 bars of about the same height. Probably microdosing is only going to be showing us the top 5 bars. There are 5 serotonin 1 receptors. 4 of them were assayed. 3 of those appear among these top 5 bars. We've also got our flavor enhancer, which just takes it to a higher level. Microdosing is basically a serotonin 1, predominantly serotonin 1. That's a cognitive mental organ, and with a little sparkle coming from serotonin 7. Some other evidence for serotonin 1 being cognitive. Solomon Snyder back in the 60s did clinical studies with this, and he concluded that in word association tests, he showed that DOT subjects produce less common but not bizarre associations. We're not sort of fixed in the standard response. We're thinking more creatively. The responses are appropriate, just not sort of the knee-jerk standard response.
What is DOT?
2,5-dimethoxy-4-ethyl-phenylisopropyl. It's the 3-carbon analog of 2-CE. This is the profile of DOET. Its best hit is serotonin 1A, and the others are serotonin 2, These ones down here, the color, the flavorful ones, you're not going to notice at a low dose. Sasha noticed that DOAT was credited with unblocking imagination and creativity. Here's an interesting report. I worked on some problems in my software. A certain problem had been plaguing me for the last 2 days. I've been putting in patches all over the place to fix the problem. Now I stumbled onto an elegant solution which made the problem evaporate. I replaced 2 pages of code with 5 elegant lines, and I was able to go back and pull out all the patches. All right, that's impressive. Here's another one where somebody used it for writing. They found a new writing voice that they really liked, and the amazing thing was that next time they sat down to write without any drug, they were able to continue to use that writing voice on through their life. That is an interesting cognitive outcome. Notice this. Here they're saying that they can easily recognize DOAT because of a feeling in their body, but it's not doing anything to the mind. I really don't feel any different mentally on DOAT. Serotonins 1 and 2 are subtle and transparent. They lack flavor. The affective mental organs, there's a lot of these. I'm going to go through a bunch of them. Imidazoline, it's in this kind of purple color. It's the best hit for MDMA. The dominant flavor of MDMA is imidazoline. It's also important in mescaline, so it produces ecstasy, empathy, openness, peace, acceptance, healing, care, forgiveness, the true letting go in one's heart of anger, grudge, guilt, and shame, where letting go of anger implies forgiving another, letting go of guilt and shame implies forgiving oneself. And this can be healing, because we're talking about emotional burdens. If you can truly let go of an emotional burden, it can heal psychosomatic issues. And it provides the ability to safely experience and contemplate mental pain. If it's a way of knowing, it's a way of knowing mental pain in a way that allows you to process it. Here's the lotus blossom again. Jesus is known for having these qualities of open-hearted tenderness, compassion, forgiveness, healing, and love, which are associated with imidazoline. Beta, the paradigmatic beta drugs are DOM and alpha-2, so the blue bar is beta. These 2CT7 and 21 haven't been assayed, but based on their properties, I believe that they're also beta drugs. There's a French term, joie de vivre, that exactly captures one important facet of beta. It's the joy of life. It's the sense of happiness, joy, elegance, luxury, the feeling of a fine brandy, the feeling of the season when all the fruits ripen, the feeling of the bustle in the street, the feeling of the smoke from the chimney when dinner is cooking, coming home to your mother's arms, the joy of cooking. That's one aspect of beta. Another aspect is home, family, community, society, humanity, and human nature that shows as a kind of wisdom in human affairs and may provide a moral compass. Here's the lotus blossom again. You can easily see beta in the writings of Confucius. I'm going to show a clip from this movie.
That's a really good perfume.
Beta also has a dark side. Turns out that there's a narrow margin between a fully psychedelic dose and a physical overdose. Apparently the beta acts at the beta receptors in the periphery. It feels like being electrocuted. This was a problem at the Human Bee in 1967 when 5,000 tablets in 10 milligram doses were passed out free to the crowd. 10 milligrams is about the level where some people get zapped and some people don't get zapped. And it's a really long-acting drug that was totally unfamiliar, and the people who were being zapped for hours and hours and hours panicked. They thought it was permanent. Alpha-2, the word rasa captures the nature of alpha-2. Ramachandran found this word from Sanskrit, capturing the very essence, the very spirit of something in order to evoke a specific mood or emotion in the viewer's brain. The alpha drugs, the green bar is alpha. The dominant flavors of mescaline and DOI are alpha, mescaline. Osmond says, a plain wooden chair was invested with a cherryness, which no chair ever had for me before. Barbed wire on a fence outside was sharp and bitter, a crown of thorns, man's eternal cruelty to man. It hurt me. He's capturing the essence of these things. Here's the lotus blossom. I believe that it's the basis of animistic religions. Things in nature have an unusually sacred spirit about them. They're objects of worship. In Japan, they build these tories in sacred spaces. They just mark it as sacred. So mountains, trees, unusual rocks, rivers, waterfalls, and other natural places. For me, this place has a very powerful rasa, and there's a huge rock in the middle of that lake. Rocks are hard, solid, durable, ancient. They're used in the design of Zen gardens because through our rasa they evoke a sense of timelessness. We get it. Water is wet, refreshing, flowing, fluid, and essential for life. We feel that. We get that too. Flowers evolved to attract pollinators with their odor and their look. We're attracted to them too. We get that. I think Alpha 2 is just common sense. But it has two facets. It allows us to behold the essential nature of the world around us as manifested by mescaline and DOI, or the essential nature of ourselves as manifested by MDA and 2CE. That manifestation appears as re-experiencing the events in your life that shaped you, the most strongly shaped you. Naranjo said this about MDA, so the person more than conceptually remembers the past, as he may vividly recapture the visual or other sensory impressions inaccessible to him in the normal state. Sasha described this for 2CE. He remembered being in his father's lap studying the Russian alphabet. This was not a memory of being 2 years old in my father's lap. This was actually being 2 years old in his lap. I was looking out of 2-year-old eyes. The Tao has been described as the soft and invisible power within all things. It is a state in which everything is seen as it is without preconceptions or illusions. It is believed to be the true nature of the mind, unburdened by knowledge or experiences. That could be a description of the entire affective domain, but I certainly see alpha and beta in the Tao. Alpha 1. Alpha 1 is the sense of the flow of events from the past to the present into the future. It's the sense of history. There are two alpha 1 receptors, A and B. The only non-controlled drugs that have perceptible affinity at alpha 1 are DMT and DPT, which are drugs with great breadth. Trying to interpret a mental organ out of a complex drug like that is questionable. Okay, the interpretation that you just saw is questionable for that reason. Fortunately, the primer probe method, which I'll be talking about shortly, has made a more selective psychedelic. The blood pressure medication clonidine can now be psychedelic, and it's much more selective for alpha 1. So here's a clonidine report. I believe that I feel a sense of continuity and that I exist in the moment and in the time around it. I occupy a greater temporal breadth. This provides a great connection. I was very present, but not just in the moment. Histamine, the archetypical drug for that is TMA2, where that's the only flavor. With TMA2, if you lay quietly with your eyes closed, you'll feel the presence of people, usually people close to you. More likely than not a family member, but it could be someone from work. It could even be if you were watching some series, it could be some character in the series, even a cartoon series. You'll feel their presence. What I believe is going on is that it's a persistent, effective theory of mind. Theory of mind is the realization that everybody has their own mind, different from our mind. When we interact with people, we're using theory of mind to try to understand them. But it appears that there's a special kind of memory. When we interact with somebody, we build a model of their heart in this special kind of memory. And each time we interact with them, we elaborate that model. We make it more subtle and more detailed. So that if it's somebody like your mother who you've interacted with most of your life, you have a pretty complete representation of her in you. And if histamine is activated, you can feel her presence. You may not see her, you may just feel her presence. It's clearly her. And you should be able to feel that even after she's died. Some people claim that these post-histamine drugs make them winning poker players, and he says, poker is about sitting in one place watching your opponent for a long time and making better observations about them than they make about you. Now there are 5 dopamine receptors. When we want to look at what are the dopamine drugs, there are a couple of different ways of doing it. We can look at what are the drugs that have the single strongest interaction with any of the 5 dopamine receptors, and that's what this list is. DMT rises to the top. Or we can say, what are the drugs that have the strongest breadth of interaction with the 5 dopamine receptors, and that's this list on the right. LSD rises to the top of that. And notice that psilocin is second on both lists. Psilocin is the cleanest dopamine drug. The dopamine is the only flavor of psilocin, so it's actually the best drug for characterizing the nature of dopamine. This is from Griffith's famous remake of the Good Friday experiment. 2/3 of the volunteers found it to be the single most meaningful experience of his or her life, or among the top 5. Similar, for example, to the birth of the first child or death of a parent, the single most spiritually significant experience of his or her life are among the top 5. The religious scholar, Houston Smith, I mentioned yesterday in the context of Esalen, was a participant in the original 1962 Good Friday experiment before writing his textbook on comparative religion that sold 2 million copies. Based on the Good Friday experiment, he said, the dominant effects of psilocin were 2. Awe, which I had known conceptually as the distinctive religious emotion, and certainty. There was no doubting that the reality I experienced was the ultimate. At high doses, 5-methoxy-DMT becomes a dopamine drug because it's the only non-serotonin receptor in the perceptible range for 5-methoxy, and this is where the God comes from in 5-methoxy. Dopamine can combine awe with uncritical certainty, can provoke a religious, spiritual sentiment, can leave deep memory traces, can make us passionate about ideas or ideology, and it can facilitate the integration of a social construct or a way of life. Awe, certainty, meaning, significance, I see that in Jesus based on his absolute faith in God and the imminent end of the world and coming of the kingdom of heaven. Let's see a representation of that. Do you recognize that face, having worn it? Sigma. Sigma is associated with the limbic system. The archetypical Sigma drug is ibogaine, for which it's the best hit. There are 2 Sigma receptors, it's got them both. It's down on the list for DMT, but it's obvious that it's a critical part of DMT's pharmacology. I believe Sigma is what is often referred to as the plant intelligence. Sigma is the core mental organ around which all the others constellate. It's the primordial mental organ from which all the others differentiated and evolved. It's the seat of biographical memory. It makes judgments about people based on whether they're genuine or not, which really means, is their behavior being controlled from the core or not? It sees the masks and facades that people put on without putting on any of its own. It's the seat of the primary emotions, anger, rage, fear, happiness, sadness, surprise, and disgust. It manifests integrity, purity, innocence, honesty. It's uncorrupted. At the same time, it's uncivilized, selfish, hedonistic, and emotional. It's sensitive to pleasure and pain. It needs the protection of the ego, and it's intimately embedded in the body, so it enjoys dance, sex. If it's carrying emotional pain, it may be responsible for a lot of psychosomatic issues. The lotus blossom, again, I believe that yoga may be a practice to work through the body to liberate Sigma from the oppression of the mental organs that have blocked it out. I've been talking about the content mental organs. Let's move on to the mechanisms of consciousness. The hands of the mind, serotonin 2, remember that? They shape the breath. Let's look at that. If we look at drugs that are selective for serotonin 2, MEM, the sigma is not perceptible there, so it's predominantly serotonin 2B. For DOP, the beta is not perceptible, so these are the 3 serotonin 2 receptors. These 2 drugs are selective for serotonin 2, so here's some trip reports. For moderate doses, for DOP, I was relaxed, no worries, warm, stable, felt good, but that's the most I felt. It's not rich at all, it's kind of boring. After I was down to the baseline, I noticed that the world was more expansive and more connected and richer than what I felt when I was high on the drug. So this drug is actually anti-psychedelic. MEM, moderate dose. The things I really care about were closer to me, and the things that I don't agree with were more distant. This is kind of the sweet spot where it allows your hands to filter, let things in that you like and keep things out that you don't like. But if we take it to a higher dose, Anne Shulgin said, there was a gray iron weight on my soul. The image I'm getting is of an awful cosmic indifference. MEM high dose, I could not muster one single thought in my brain or feel anything. Being unable to think was so obvious that it upset me. I felt my brain was empty, blank. I came to see serotonin 2 as the gatekeeper to consciousness, such that the more strongly you activate it, the more it closes the gates. If you deactivate it, the gates fly open and you can be overwhelmed by sensation. I viewed it as anti-psychedelic for a decade, based on just this data, this natural history. This is what the natural history says. So I had this insight. The dramatic effects of psychedelic drugs come from everything but serotonin 1 and 2. It's completely contradictory to the paradigm. Serotonin 2 as gatekeeper is anti-psychedelic because it closes the gates of consciousness. But after seeing it this way for a decade, the natural history gave me another insight. The first part is still true. The dramatic effects of psychedelic come from everything but 1 and 2. But seeing serotonin 2 as hands makes it psychedelic because it holds other mental organs in consciousness. Here, the hand, serotonin 2, is holding imidazoline in consciousness, where that brain is the consciousness. This changed my view of serotonin 2. I came to see it as if the goddess Durga, the hands that can do many things. So for example, this hand in the upper left is the gatekeeper. It's just filtering things out. This one in the middle, focusing attention. The one on the lower right, bringing something into consciousness. The upper right is holding something in consciousness. The one on the lower left is blocking a memory from consciousness. So I see serotonin 2 as shaping consciousness by doing all of these things. These observations led to a hypothesis. Remember early when I introduced the concept of mental organs, I said they can be in consciousness or not. They can be in or out of consciousness. In order for a content mental organ to enter consciousness, two things must happen. The content mental organ must be activated directly at its defining receptor, so we would need to activate imidazoline directly. And the mental organ must be held in consciousness by simultaneous activation of serotonin 2, the hands of the mind. This is the undrugged state. The hand of the mind is acting as the gatekeeper. Let's put in MEM. MEM is selective for serotonin 2B, and it's making the hand larger. It's making the hand stronger. So that's MEM. It's closing the gates of consciousness. Now let's look at the blood pressure medication, rilmenidine. Rilmenidine is selective for imidazoline. It activates imidazoline receptors in the brain, but the imidazoline mental organ doesn't enter consciousness. So I've drawn the eye outside of the icon of consciousness. It just reduces blood pressure. But it's using the receptor, the imidazoline receptor. Now, MDMA, its primary site of action is imidazoline, the same imidazoline that rilmenidine acts at without entering consciousness. But it also acts at serotonin 2B. That's the same receptor that MEM acted at. So when we get those two together, imidazoline enters and is held in consciousness. It ought to be the case that if we took MEM and rilmenidine together, the same thing should happen. Why shouldn't we get the same result? I published that hypothesis about a year and a half ago. Subsequently, some reports have begun to appear. This is from the Shulgin archive. This is taking rilmenidine and 2CB-fly together. The result was spectacular. I got a +4 experience from a pure imidazoline blood pressure medication. It is probably the entactogenic core of MDMA. I was astonished by the depth of the experience, and I remained astonished for 2 weeks. The mental state was ecstatic, somewhat unsober. I recalled Martin Ball calling 5-methoxy-DMT the crown jewel of the entheogens. I felt that rilmenidine must also be a crown jewel. I described the state with superlatives. It's like a peaceful lake. It feels eternal. I spoke to my wife about what to me were the core issues in our relationship. These are things that are very hard to discuss because they are painful and discussion tends to lead to anger, but we discussed it peacefully. I expressed my sadness with tears. I believe this capacity for calm contemplation and discussion of painful personal issues is a core feature of the entactogenic state of MDMA, and here I was experiencing it with blood pressure medication. For me, it's really astonishingly among the best psychedelic experiences I've ever had. Unbelievable.
Both of those quotes obviously aren't from Shulgin.
No, they're not from Shulgin. They're in the Shulgin archive.
Got it.
Who they're from, I can't say.
Got it.
Right.
So they're just trip reports within the Shulgin.
Trip reports in the Shulgin archive,
Got it.
yes.
Thank you.
The primers. The hypothesis is that if you take a primer, which is selective for serotonin 2, or serotonin 2 and serotonin 1, together with a probe, which I'll get to in a moment. So here are the primers. MEM-DOB are both selected for serotonin 2. 2-CB-Fly and DOAT are selected for serotonin 2 and serotonin 1. These drugs are boring. They're subtle, they close the gates of consciousness, they're like what I described for MEM and DOB, all four of them. But if you take those together with probes, agonists at non-serotonin receptors, the content organs, so now we've got blood pressure for imidazoline, blood pressure for alpha-1, Parkinson's for dopamine, decongestant bronchodilator for beta, anti-vertigo for histamine 1, cough suppressant and ketamine for sigma. If we take the primer and the probe together, the probe becomes psychedelic. It means that you no longer need a synthetic chemistry lab to create a new psychedelic.
It's got everybody excited.
Let's look at my idea of the therapeutic mechanism of MDMA based on the hands of the mind. Here we've got a hand blocking a memory from consciousness. Let's peek inside and see what's being blocked. Okay, I'm seeing a trauma, so we've got a trauma there. If that trauma were being held fully in consciousness, that would be too painful to tolerate. In fact, it may re-traumatize or further traumatize just holding that memory in consciousness. But if we simultaneously hold imidazoline in consciousness, remember imidazoline, that allows us to experience mental pain such that we can contemplate it, we can process it therapeutically, and we can heal. I believe this is the mechanism by which MDMA treats PTSD. The breadth of consciousness is the number and diversity of content mental organs held in consciousness, and that's shaped by serotonin 2. I've finished my discussion of the hands of the mind shaping breadth. Let's move on to depth. Breadth and depth. Breadth provides a more complete and multifaceted experience of actual reality, that which actually exists internally, externally, or socially. Depth, mediated by serotonin 7, adds the spark of creativity and allows us to go beyond actual reality, using our imagination, our creative capacity to add to actual reality, to add novelty generated by our minds to that which actually exists, to consider not just what is, but also what could be. This is what serotonin 7 gives us. Every receptor operates on a spectrum, and what I'm going to do with serotonin 7 is I'm going to describe it starting from the normal unmedicated state and moving up with successively higher levels of activation. This is a quote from Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, where the Parson St. John's, I believe, is describing serotonin 7, which he interprets as religion. He says, "From the minute germ, natural affection, she has developed the overshadowing tree, philanthropy. From the wild, stringy root of human uprightness, she has reared a due sense of the divine justice." Serotonin 7 takes it to a higher level. Serotonin 7 activation alters anything that enters consciousness. There seem to be common themes to its effect. It adds a creative exuberance. It takes it to a higher level. It makes connections. It comprehends the bigger picture. It creates sumptuousness, sparkle, grandeur, majesty, transcendence. Intangible becomes tangible. Thoughts, feelings, motivations originating from within may be perceived to originate from without. Anything held in consciousness becomes rendered at higher resolution. Now that's a computer metaphor, but what I really mean is greater subtlety, nuance, complexity, tangibility, capacity, and vividness of thought, feeling, and sensory input. Things become more tangible as if perceived through the senses. It feels like genius. It lifts the spirits. The sense of self can become thin or disappear. The sense of something greater than oneself, greater power, God, when it's combined with dopamine. Cosmic, as in from the galaxies down to the subatomic particles. Alex Gray said, "You are one with the same force that provides the spiral arms of the galaxy." That universal creativity is also what you are as well. That's serotonin 7 thinking. It can create a sense of autonomy. It can result in the creation of alternate worlds populated by entities. Mark Ball described the non-self volition of 5-methoxy, where the body goes through non-volitional movements and you make these animalistic vocalizations. You may feel that you've been imparted knowledge from an autonomous source. You may feel immersed in power, such as within a nuclear explosion. You may feel that the mind exists independent of the body, before or after the body, or transcends the cycle of birth and death, as illustrated by this Moody Blues album cover. Serotonin 7 mediates the most dramatic effects of psychedelic drugs. I want to focus on these three because these three are the easiest to interpret from trip reports, which are my raw natural history data. Open-eyed creative visuals, ego loss, loss of contact with reality, VER. So I'm going to use VER to refer to this set of effects. Let's go through each one. Loss of contact with reality. All this takes is high serotonin 7, regardless of what else is going on. When the creative productions of the serotonin system become more salient than actual reality, you pass through a mental event horizon, beyond the veil. You experience a discontinuity in mental space and time. The mind may become a cornucopia. You may experience a mental Big Bang creating worlds, universes. This is the spectrum, and there is this discontinuity in the spectrum. It's been called the veil. Rockrosam referred to it as event horizon, which I also call it. Ego loss. Ego loss requires high serotonin 7 and low serotonin 2. There's lotus blossom again. It's believed that the Buddha achieved this state through meditation. So the ego loss drugs, most psychedelics, when they act at the serotonin receptor, they produce about 100%, around 100% of the activity that serotonin would produce at that receptor. But the ego loss drugs have very low activity at that receptor. LSD's in the range of 0 to 25% of what serotonin would produce at 5-HT2. Psilocin, the percentages are also low. So these drugs are prone to produce ego loss. But 5-methoxy-DMT is the one that most reliably produces ego loss. It's the one that has the cleanest presentation of serotonin 7. And importantly, it's in a pharmacological class all alone in respect to its relationship to the serotonin 2 receptors. There are 3 serotonin 2 receptors, 2A, 2B, and 2C. And what I've put in these 3 columns is the relative affinity at each of those 3 receptors. This column on the left is just the maximum of the 3 on the right. So I got a 1.54 here from that column. So let's just look at this column. And you can see that 5-methoxy-DMT has less than half the affinity of any other psychedelic at collectively the serotonin 2 receptors. All of them are well below the 2.0 limit of perceptibility. So it's the only significant psychedelic drug that has no perceptible affinity at any of the 3 serotonin 2 receptors. And that is the reason why it reliably produces ego loss. In order to represent expansion of consciousness, I'm going to put the body in here kind of for scales. There's the expanded consciousness. So let's back up. I've got the mind, and in that mind is the hand of the mind. We're going to put 5-methoxy in there, and we've expanded the consciousness, but look at the hands of the mind. It hasn't been touched. 5-methoxy doesn't have any perceptible affinity for serotonin 2, so we don't mess with that. We just expand the mind, and this is a moderate dose, and you become a drop in the ocean at a moderate dose. At a high dose, notice the difference between the high and the moderate dose. We bring the dopamine in at the high dose, and so this is where the God comes from. Let's compare that to DMT. I haven't put all of DMT in here, just the parts relative to ego loss. Look at the hands of the mind. 5-methoxy, the hand is small, untouched, but for DMT, serotonin 2 has a full perceptibility and activity, so the hands of the mind are also enlarged in DMT, and that's why you don't tend to have ego loss in DMT, and that's true for all of the psychedelics except for LSD, psilocybin, and 5-methoxy. The sense of self appears to emerge from the act of serotonin 2 shaping serotonin 7. So when serotonin 7 is too strong for serotonin 2, the sense of self can melt away. We may feel like a drop in the ocean. Open-eyed creative visuals requires both depth from serotonin 7 and breadth from some of the other receptors. I'm going to look at open-eyed creative visuals at 3 degrees of manifestation. 2CE, this is from Sasha. He's describing, he lay on the bed, he saw himself as an old man. Many years in the future, he was appalled to see forearm as withered, dry-skinned. I'm talking about open-eyed creative visuals. He's looking at his body, seeing it as an old man. This one, they go out on the street in Greenwich Village on LSD, and they see a 70-year-old lady coming down the street with bags, and they see her age backwards in time, all the way to her birth, and then age forward in time, all the way to her death. The nature of open-eyed creative visuals is you take what you actually see and you transform it with your mind. You add the spark of creativity to that which actually is. And then at the limit, when you cross over the veil into an alternate reality, then you apparently just create a world. DMT is the drug that simultaneously has the greatest depth and the greatest breadth. Here's the resting state. Put DMT in, and you get an alternate reality because not only have you expanded consciousness, but you've brought all these mental organs in. There's a lot going on here, and that's what it takes to produce an alternate reality. Now you compare that to 5-methoxy, where you expand consciousness, but there's no content. So you get a formless void with 5-methoxy, and you get an alternate reality with DMT because you have all of the content mental organs. You're not going to have an alternate reality without content. So 5-methoxy doesn't produce an alternate reality, it produces an ego loss and a formless void. Matt Baggett suggested using blind raters, and I had dozens of students read 250 trip reports, and they were trained to recognize open-eyed creative visuals, ego loss, and loss of contact with reality. So for each of the 250 trip reports, they had to say present or absent for each of those three things. The result was a very strong bimodal distribution. Drugs either had it or they didn't have it. If I plot that against relative affinity at serotonin 7, it completely, without exception, separates high VER drugs from low VER drugs. But if I plot it with respect to any serotonin 2 receptor, there's no separation at all. So it's pretty clear that these effects, VER, are coming from serotonin 7, not serotonin 2. Serotonin 7 provides the spark of creativity, and serotonin 2 shapes that creativity, giving it form, and I believe that this is where free will and volition emerges from this dynamic. You may have noticed that the human mind is not healthy. I'm going to use the phrase hard ego to describe this pernicious behavior that we seek after power, prestige, possession, control, acquisition, ambition, competition, superiority. We want long, hard work. We play social roles. We want to be right and special. We want to have fame, praise, recognition, admiration, notice, others' attention. We go for whatever we can get away with, psychopathy. And from this mind flows bad things. War, industrial war, nuclear war, genocide, slavery, colonialism, rape, mass rape, gang rape, child rape, murder, mass murder, serial murder, terrorism, torture, pillage, subjugation of women, polygamy, unequal opportunity, unequal justice, and the list goes on in both columns. What's going on here? I believe that a central cause of this is the loss of affect. I noted that our mind shifts from affective to cognitive as we evolve into modern humans and as we grow from infant to adult. Let me tell you a story. An alumnus of my university came to see me. He was a mathematician. Right off the bat, he tells me that he and everyone in his family has severe ADHD. And I say, oh, I think I'm on that spectrum too. And he was really startled to hear that. He said, what do you mean by that? So I told him a story I'd never told anybody. I said, well, when I was a child, I really loved reading anything, including fiction, and gosh, when I read The Hobbit, that world was just so real to me. When I finished it, I just wanted it to be real. It was just so fantastic. And then suddenly that stopped when I was about 12 or 13 years old, and reading became sterile. I thought I had become stupid. My memory was shot, and reading had become sterile. Well, I told him the story. He looks at me and says, exactly the same thing happened to me at the same age. And we were both startled to hear this because we didn't realize that this wasn't something unique to our own experiences. This seems to be a normal thing for a lot of, especially men. Here's what I think is going on. I want to separate the parts of the mind into sort of three evolutionary tiers. At the bottom, we have the primal emotions: anger, rage, fear, sadness, surprise, disgust. In the middle, we have affect: beauty, home, elegance, majesty, adventure, hope, joy, sublime. At the top, we have modern adult cognition: language, logic, and reason. What I think is going on is that the mind has become hollowed out. We retain the language, logic, and reason, and the primal emotions, but we've lost this middle tier of affect. And I think that is what leads to the hard ego. Cue the video.
It's about cryptography.
Like secret messages.
Not secret. That's the brilliant part. Messages that anyone can see, but no one knows what they mean, unless you have the key.
How's that different from talking?
Talking?
When people talk to each other, they never say what they mean, they say something else. And you're expected to just know what they mean. Only I never do. How's that different?
Alan, I have a funny feeling you're going to be very good at this.
The boys were going to get some lunch. Alan?
Yes?
I said we're going to get some lunch. Alan?
Yes?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I said we're off to get some lunch. This is starting to get a little bit repetitive.
What is?
I had asked if you wanted to come to lunch with us.
No, you didn't. You said you were going to get some lunch.
Have I offended you in some way?
Why would you think that?
Would you like to come to lunch with us?
What time's lunchtime?
Christ, Alan, it's a bleeding sandwich.
What is?
Lunch.
Oh, I don't like sandwiches.
Never mind.
Who's hungry? Let's go.
I'm hungry.
What?
Peter asked who was hungry. Can I have some soup, please?
He's got a pretty extreme case, but that's what it looks like. You know, I'm on that spectrum somewhere. I'm a scientist. Sasha speculated that the psychedelic drugs reveal the normal state through some disinhibition of an evolutionarily imposed safeguard. Perhaps these chemicals restore certain neurological functions that have been lost through evolution. To many people, the states experienced are familiar territory that have been lost in some primal amnesia. And I think not so distant past, but actually we experienced those states as children. So I want to talk about what I think the forces are that have driven us to this point. And let me introduce this concept of the evolution. Our biology creates an innate psychology that gives us the capacity for culture, but that then becomes a part of our culture to which, if we live in a stable culture for long enough, we can become biologically adapted to that culture. I think the initial problem was our path towards violence, that we chose to engage in the brutal mass murder of our neighbors as a regular part of our existence that we call warfare. Predominantly men engage in that activity, and that we adapted to that. And it shaped a mind that's adapted to that environment, that cultural environment of warfare. Then we built mind-numbing places to live. That's only recently. We haven't had time to biologically adapt. So I'm going to change the time scale here. Let's talk about the mind, which is the most adaptive entity in the known universe. It adapts over the lifespan. It adapts from moment to moment. So we build this environment, and our mind adapts to that. And what does it do? Well, it definitely is anti-affective. It's good for the cognitive, but bad for the affective. Then we send our children to school at a tender age, and what do we teach them? Reading, writing, and arithmetic, pure cognition. Then we get jobs. They may be mind-numbing jobs. We live in a society that wants us to be productive workers and consumers, but has no place for affect. Now even our social interactions have become mediated. Torrey noticed a 6-fold increase in mental illness in a single century and observed that it would parallel the rise of urban industrial society. It seems to be a disease of civilization. All of the forces that I see are leading to this hard ego, from which flows this horrific Darwinian ethic, which is normalized now. We see all of this as normal. Here's the problem. The problem is the hard ego. So what is the solution? Some people here, I think, would suggest ego loss as a solution, but I want to suggest that there's a middle way, that there's a soft ego. The soft ego arises if you bring any one or more affective mental organs into consciousness. This is what MDMA does, what mescaline does. Lots of psychedelic drugs do this. This state, the hollowed out mind, produces hard ego. We need to go back to the soft ego. If we can simply restore the effect, it takes us back to the soft ego. Eckhart Tolle noted, to the extent that we live in the hard ego, he didn't use that phrase, but the more shallow and lifeless your reality becomes, and the more deadened you become to reality. In this way, cleverness may be gained. The soft ego, with the soft ego, you have a sense of the miraculous returns to your life. A depth returns to your life. Things regain their newness, their freshness, and the greatest miracle is the experiencing of your essential self as prior to any words, thoughts, mental labels, and images. The miracle of life that continuously unfolds within and around you, wisdom, joy, love, creativity, and aliveness. Just as we've seen a collapse of biological species diversity resulting in human-produced monocultures, I believe that we've seen a collapse of mental organ diversity resulting in a cognitive monoculture. I took a tour through the diversity of affective mental organs, and I talked about each of these traditions representing a significant bloom of a particular mental organ, but we ought to be thinking about how to cultivate the full bouquet rather than being satisfied with the mental organ associated with some tradition that by chance we happen to be born into. How to do that? And what would it even look like? I have a friend that reads a dictionary from A to Z to enhance their vocabulary, and I was startled because I knew that wouldn't work for me. So I said, what's going on there? This is their description of reading a dictionary. I would feel the rumbling sound of a tire rolling on an asphalt road in the word road. In the word abject, I would sense the sorrow, a perilous state a person might be in, his facial expression, his skin tone, his possible gestures and gaits. I remember the word sandalwood. I liked it at the moment I saw it, and it actually invoked a mood associated with an imagined story, so I wrote a poem with it. If it's a rainy day, I might be able to simultaneously feel the moisture of the air and its grassy and earthy smells while turning the leaves of my dictionary. And if I peruse my dictionary at sunset, I would feel the dancing quality of the sun's rays. It's very relaxing and easy. I don't know about you, but when I read a dictionary, it's nothing like that. I don't know if this is the full bouquet, but I know that it's a richer bouquet than the one that I live in. Let me tell you a little bit more about this mind. This person has a master's in electrical engineering. They're employed as an information technology specialist. They're a virtuoso programmer in multiple programming languages. When they took organic chemistry at my university, in a class of 300 students, they were the top student 2 semesters in a row, and they're currently a graduate student in the English department writing a novel for their thesis about the mind. Of course, I'm totally biased about this person because it's my wife of 15 years who's sitting like that. This is what I think a fuller bouquet looks like. So how can we restore breadth of consciousness, either momentarily or long-term? I want to talk about 2 drugs that have a full bouquet quality to them, and let me contrast them. Let's start first with DMT, which actively loads, using the serotonin 2 mechanism that I hypothesized, it actively loads all of these and more mental organs into consciousness. So they're forced into consciousness, and consciousness is expanded. Cannabis, just look at the difference. The difference basically is I've taken the hands away. Cannabis doesn't force anything into consciousness, but it removes the blocks. So that then in the natural flow of events, if some mental organ would normally come into play in our archaic past, that can happen. And it doesn't do this for everybody. We're just beginning to dive into the study of the cannabis literature to understand what's going on there. I think it might have to do with tolerance for people who abuse it, but it has this capacity. These are things that I think can help. Now, when I talk about using DMT to restore the full bouquet, to restore our humanity, I want to emphasize that there's this discontinuity in the serotonin 7 spectrum, the veil. And this side of the veil, I posit that we are fully human, and on the other side of the veil, we are fully alien. This DMT volunteer in Strassman's study noted this. He said, this is the farthest reaches of our humanity. This is the doorway into what defines you as a human being. When you go past that, you stop being human to a degree. And the further you get past this point, the further away you go from being a human being. But right here, this door is everything. It's everything. It's what defines you as a human being. This is you. Alexander Ward, he described ayahuasca as the clearest mirror imaginable. You see how you really are. Robe observed ayahuasca users have become better partners to their spouses, better parents to their children, better children to their parents, better employees, better employers, just more responsible overall, bringing a higher level of ethical integrity to everything they do. Now, I think that this ethical integrity emerges from reintegration with Sigma, which I believe is what people refer to as the plant intelligence, and this is something that DMT can bring. But I think that if we're talking about restoring our humanity, we're not going to find that on the other side of the veil. We're going to find it on this side of the veil. And I think there ought to be more exploration of these drugs on this side of the veil. This is the inner pantheon revealed by the breadth of psychedelic drugs. Many of these are considered entheogens, implying that they are the sacraments of a particular tradition. And I just hope that we don't fall into a kind of a sectarianism, I hope that we can coexist, that all of these traditions can coexist, and we shouldn't get too caught up in claims that drug X is the one true entheogen, for example.
Utterly glad you made it.